Amen. All righty, I mentioned to you that suffering and glory are the themes that are before us right now, and it continues to be thematic, at least in this next little paragraph. They're coming down the mountain. He commanded them they should tell no one these things until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This is the last time in Mark's gospel we have a so-called command to silence. We've seen it many times. Don't go telling everybody what's just happened. Jesus says that. This is the last time he makes such a command. This time it's provisional. Don't tell people about this until the Son of Man has risen from the dead, presumably, at least impliedly suggesting that once the great events of the gospel have taken place, the death, the resurrection, the ascension of Christ, once these things have occurred, everything else comes into focus. But until those things have occurred, we're sort of wandering in the mist. And we certainly appreciate the disciples, a little bit flummoxed most of the time by just what's going on here. And so Jesus wants to warn them, just keep this under your hats until those great events have occurred, until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Hopefully, these three who were at the Mount of Transfiguration would have a kind of confidence because they've seen the glory of Christ. This apparent train wreck that's going to happen in Jerusalem is for them not going to be such a big mishap because they know this is a glorious person who's among them. A glory that's concealed for the most part to others, but they've caught a glimpse of it. And so they're hopefully going to be able to encourage their fellow disciples during these dark days that are going to come in Jerusalem, although even these three guys get pretty shaken up, by the time it's over, as you'll recall. Well, they kept this word to themselves, but questioning what in the world does this rising from the dead mean? Probably took a fair amount of self-discipline to not say anything about this transfiguration that they had just viewed, but Jesus commands them to keep it to themselves. They're not sure what to make of the rising from the dead. They're not sure to make of the whole issue of suffering and death. How does this fit? You're the king. Peter had objected. He'd rebuked Jesus over this, and Jesus had stopped him. But nevertheless, they all are kind of wondering, how in the world can this be experience associated with the Messiah? It doesn't fit at all what they were expecting. Finally, they're able to piece together a question. It seems like a strange question, I suppose, but packaged inside it is a whole lot more than shows up facially. And they ask the question, well, then why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? They've just seen Elijah on the mountain. They're kind of thinking about Elijah. And now they remember the scribes always taught that Elijah would come first. That was official teaching. And the idea was he was going to come and he was going to restore things. This was part of the idea that was associated with Elijah, that he never died. He was taken up into heaven, in a fiery chariot. They sort of had an idea that he was still out there somewhere in outer space. One of these days he's going to come back. And then Malachi reinforces the whole idea by saying in the very last paragraph of the Old Testament that Elijah would be coming and that he would fix things. So Malachi says, I'll send you Elijah the prophet, and he will turn the hearts of fathers to the children, and the hearts of children to the fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. So there was this package associated with Elijah in rabbinic teaching. Elijah was going to come. He was going to straighten this place up. He was going to get us on the right track. He was going to prepare the way before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, before the advent of Messiah. And now the disciples are sort of wondering to themselves, well, if Elijah's going to do all that, then how come the Messiah would have to suffer? If Elijah's going to fix things, then what's this suffering that keeps hanging in the air? And so that seems to be what's driving the question they put to him. Well, Jesus answered and said to them, well, indeed, Elijah is coming. He restores all things. And now, as if to articulate the question that's in their minds, he says, so how is it written concerning the Son of Man that he must suffer? If Elijah was going to fix things up, why must the Messiah suffer? I know that's what you guys are wondering. Why must he suffer these things and be treated with contempt? So Jesus facially agrees with the scribal teaching that Elijah would come. He poses the question that's presumably in their minds. If Elijah restores all things, why this business of suffering? And now Jesus gives the critical corrective to rabbinic teaching. I say to you, Elijah has come. I agree Elijah is coming, but now let me clarify. He's already come, you see. And they did to him whatever they wished, as it's written of. It's a strong conjunction, the stronger conjunction in Greek, but I say to you, correcting now the impression from the first statement. And of course, Mark leaves unstated what both Matthew and Luke provide, that this Elijah who has come is none other than our friend John the Baptist. He's the one who Jesus otherwise identifies as the one that came in the spirit of Elijah. This is the one who is in fact the character predicted by Malachi, who would come and restore all things. And indeed, John the Baptist did restore all things, but not in the way people thought. They thought Elijah would come and straighten things out in a kind of externalized expression, the social order. But John the Baptist restores things inwardly. He develops an inward submission to the authority of Christ, to the authority of the coming Messiah, rather than a simple outward conformity to some sort of external standard. So John the Baptist did exactly what Malachi had predicted. He's met the terms of that prediction, and Jesus now wants to say to them that that is in fact what's taken place, and it's part of this that is now leading to the establishment of my kingdom. But Jesus adds, of course, they did to him whatever they wished. So here's the little footnote to the whole thing. We've said, so far we've learned that there's the via dolorosa and the via gloria. There's the way of suffering, which must precede the way of glory. Messiah must suffer, but in fact even John the Baptist, even this Elijah, suffered. Nobody's exempt from this. And if you're going to be my disciple, you will suffer. You will set aside your own self-interest. You will take up your cross. You will follow me right into Jerusalem. You will join me in this. Because that's the only way we get to glory, is by following in this path. And so nobody is left out of the picture here. Even this Elijah, a.k.a. John the Baptist, had to experience it that way. So a little detail from last week, and now we move on to the story that's properly before us. As I said, you might say the objective truth of the kingdom that Jesus, or that Mark is teaching us now through Jesus, is their suffering leading to glory. In a sense, the subjective side of this is there's faith leading to a display of God's power. And this man who brings his son, demon-possessed, to Jesus is our exemplar of that great truth. Faith really is only tested in times of suffering. You know, it's so easy to believe when life is going so well. But into the reversals of life, it's when things are not going so well, when you're just wondering, what is going on in my life? That's when faith is sort of put to the test. You know. Peter raises the question in 1 Peter. It may be necessary that for a little while some of you may have to suffer tribulation and all kinds of trials. These have come, he said, so that your faith, which is more precious than gold, may be proved genuine. It's in the crucible that your faith is proven to be the genuine article, you see. Not when life is easy, but when life is hard. And so in this point, we learn that the suffering in this objective circumstance of life is exercising faith, as it were, in the subjective side of things, so that as we trust Christ, His power is unleashed, His power is unleashed to the glory of God. And so this story is, in a sense, a complement to what we saw last week in the Transfiguration, and it is, in fact, the story that's familiar to all of us of this young boy. It's a lengthy story. I'm going to be hustling, and I just apologize if I seem a little breathless. I want to get through this, and so I'll try to be as efficient as I can and avoid all those tempting rabbit tracks that just pop up constantly. Here we go. When they came, 3 paragraphs, we'll take them a paragraph at a time. When they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and some scribes arguing with them. When the whole crowd saw him, they were immediately overcome with awe, and they ran forward to greet him. He asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" Someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak, and whenever it seizes him, it dashes him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." So Jesus has come down from the mount with the three that were with him. Luke tells us it was the following day, so we'll take that. It's probably mid-morning, then the next day. Down they come, approaching the other disciples, the ones who had been left behind, but they haven't been idle. They've been busy. They're continuing their labors. But now they've sort of run into difficulties. And they've gotten into these difficulties courtesy of the scribes, who are sort of seizing on the opportunity to embarrass Jesus in his absence by tying these disciples up a bit in knots. You know, that's kind of the way that cults work. They never attack the strong, they attack the weak. When Israel came out of Egypt, they were attacked by Amalek, you may recall. Amalek didn't do a frontal assault, sneaked up in the rear, grabbing the people who were the most frail, the most vulnerable, the most tired, straggling along at the back. You see, that's where the attack will come, and that's the way these guys are acting. They're going after those who seem vulnerable now in the absence of Jesus. So you have this picture of glory on the mountain contrasted with squabbling, carping, difficulties tangled up in knots here at the bottom of the mountain. Raphael, the Renaissance painter, has a great painting entitled "The Healing of the Boy at the Bottom of the Mountain." The painting is in two stories. The lower story, if you can see that, hope you can kind of make that out. On the right-hand side, you got this boy, demon-possessed, in all kinds of conflict and turmoil, and the disciples are gathered around trying, to cast this demon out. On the left-hand side of the picture, these scribes are pointing their fingers and accusing and fault-finding and nitpicking and trying to keep them from having any success and just being pretty obstructionist in the whole thing. So we've got a kind of messy situation down here at the bottom of the mountain. And yet at the top of the mountain, in stark contrast, is what Raphael wants us to see as glory, the transfigured Christ. Here we have Moses and Elijah, glorious with him. And then you've got the three disciples, Peter, James, and John, beholding this. And you can kind of see the striking dissimilarity between the two, the elegance of the one contrasted with the difficulties of the other. And many people think Raphael was trying to, in the spirit of the Renaissance, say that while we need these moments of glory, the Christian faith is lived on the street. We experience times of glory, that's great, but we don't live there. We come to church, we hear a sermon, it inspires us. We hear the choir sing, we catch a glimpse of glory in that beautiful music. We pray prayers, we participate, but we're not supposed to stay in church all week, you see. We don't pitch a tent there. We go back to real life, back to the neighborhood, back to the job, back to the place where life is more difficult. And that really is what it seems Raphael is reminding us of here. And that really is what the story is telling us in some ways as well. Well, immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed and running together greeted him. It's a rather startling word that Mark uses for greatly amazed. It's the word exathombethe, and it's much stronger than the English translations really ever convey it. At least I never found one that quite gets at it. The word suggests trembling astonishment, alarm, near panic. It's a very strong word. It's only used by Mark in the New Testament. Mark uses it 3 times, once here, once to describe Christ himself in the Garden of Gethsemane, same word. He took with him Peter, James, and John, same 3 guys, began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Exalampathe, you see. He was disturbed down in the very heart of his being as he was anticipating the prospect of the cross, of God the Father turning his back on him, pouring out wrath on him, atoning for the sins of those for whom he died. The other place where the word shows up in Mark is when the women come to the tomb in Mark chapter 16. And they enter the tomb and they see a man clothed in a long white robe sitting at the right hand, and they were alarmed, is the way that it's translated. Terrified, panic-stricken by the whole thing. And they really kind of leave in the same spirit, you know. The last word of Mark's gospel, at least verse 8, the gospel proper without the epilogue, is fear. They left in fear. They were afraid. So Mark is using this word strategically, and this is the first time, describing these people who see Jesus coming, and they are filled with a kind of awestruck wonder. Apparently, Mark wants us to appreciate that the presence and authority of Jesus are going to fully transcend at this point the carping scribes and the cowering disciples. Jesus is going to come completely above all of this, bringing his awesome, majestic presence to bear. Well, the people, in spite of their fear, at the same time rally, they run, they greet him, maybe hoping to see Jesus defend his disciples, maybe sensing some of the residual effects of the Transfiguration, something like Moses when he came down from the mountain was glowing, you may recall that. But Jesus steps up. What are you discussing with them? The question is addressed to the scribes, not to the disciples. He's interrupting the scribes, presumably to defend his disciples at this point. He's requiring that they direct their inquiry to Jesus. This is a little bit like a teacher interrupting a bully on the playground. Why don't you pick on somebody your own size, you see? And Jesus is fully up to the task. And so as he approaches them, he interrupts this dispute that's going on. What are you discussing with them? The root of the word that's used here for discussing is actually the word zeteo, which means to seek. It's a word used in Mark, but never positively. It's always a word with a negative connotation to it. It means seeking in the sense of, or in the spirit of fault-finding, questioning, challenging, cross-examining, needling, picking, that kind of thing. Looking for some flaw, you see. That's what's going on. And so that's the word Jesus puts to them. Why are you discussing, in that sense, these things with them? They had paralyzed the disciples. And they, of course, have done it. And at the very heart of this whole discussion is this tragic boy. He needs somebody's attention. All the scribes are worried about is scoring some points at the expense of the disciples, and at least inferentially at the expense of Christ himself. And nevertheless, or at the same time, this boy is really being ignored. One commentator was playing with that a little bit, and he said, quote, "There were endless committee discussions of slavery during abolition and child labor during the Industrial Revolution." There were all kinds of committee meetings, people wringing their hands and worrying and wondering, what should we do about this? But nobody did anything, you see. Nobody had the courage to actually meet these evils in the public square, but they could talk about it a lot. And in some ways, you might say that was a little of what was happening here. Well, Jesus cuts off this wrangling about a case study and begins to focus on the case itself. And it all comes into light with this fellow who cries out from the crowd, a father, and the father is the story. This is not so much a story of the son who, of course, is healed when it's all over, but it's the story of a father in suffering, a father who's on the Via Dolorosa, a father who is at his wit's end, who's tragically wrapped up in the deep care and concern he has for his son and is feeling utterly helpless. And it's the father being led in faith to a display of God's power through Christ that really is the agenda that Mark has before us here. So this man cries out, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit." This guy doesn't care about the theological argument, you know. He doesn't care who wins the debate. He just wants something for his son. And so he says he has a mute spirit. The overall symptomology here looks a lot like epilepsy. Now, in the New Testament, the demon activity is, of course, taken for granted. In fact, many times demon activity is tied to various kinds of maladies. Paul, for example, says, I was suffering this agonizing thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan. He's suffering some kind of malady, and he attributes it to Satan, and yet that is really a physical malady of some kind. So in the New Testament, we have that notion. And so it may have been epilepsy, but at the same time, it seems tied to some sort of demon activity here. And of course, the whole strong man motif of Mark has really made that theme pretty clear on a repeated basis. Interestingly, Matthew uses a different word. He uses the word, the man says of his son, he's a lunatic. The root of the word lunatic is luna, like the moon, a lunar cycle. And in the ancient world, they believed some people were susceptible to lunar cycles. And when the moon would reach a certain point, the new moon or the full moon or something, they would have a lunacy. And so Matthew actually calls it by that diagnostic category. That may be behind Psalm 121:6. The moon will not smite thee by night. You see, one of the protective promises made by God was protection against that kind of thing. Well, either way, the man says whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out. And then these words of rich pathos, but they could not. They could not. Strong language. Seizes him. Katalabe, to pull down, to throw down. The next word, actually usually translated throws down, is the word rese. It's a word that was ordinarily used to apply to a dog. When a dog would grab some kind of creature, you know how they'll sometimes do, and just shake it around, bang it on the ground, that. So it's a word that has a certain degree of drama to it. Grabs him, throws him down. It implies a strong, sudden, irresistible, powerful kind of invasion of this boy's life, and he just completely loses control, and nobody really can control or predict the situation. The effects of it, he foams, he gnashes, he becomes rigid. This is minute description. Most of us in the room are parents. Many of us are grandparents. We've had the situation of taking an ailing child to the doctor. You know how it is, if you're really worried about your kid, you want the doctor to know everything. You don't want anything to be missing, because that might be the critical thing the doctor needs to know to do a good DX in this moment, And so we go into some detail. And Mark wants us to see that in this man. He's telling Jesus the whole story. He wants Jesus to, because maybe Jesus won't be able to give the right diagnosis if he doesn't have all the information. And what's interesting is that Jesus listens patiently. He listens patiently. And if you've been sleeping till this point, this is where I urge you to wake up for a moment at least. Because faith starts at the point of our felt need. Faith doesn't come floating in like some kind of great platitude from outer space and just sort of a nice idea. Oh, that's lovely. I think I'll embrace that. That's not faith. I think most of us, if we have an idea of where we've really sensed faith beginning in our lives or growing in our lives, it virtually always is in the midst of some kind of real pressure, real tension with real details. And it's in the details that faith gets a root in our hearts. And so Jesus doesn't want to deprive this man. He doesn't say to this man, oh, hey, look, man, I get it. I know what you're feeling. I can handle this. You don't need to give me all this. No, Jesus listens to the man because the story is about the Father. The story is about his growth in faith, and the details of this agony he's in are related to a son that he loves so much. And as he reaches the end of his discussion, all he can say is they could not. Not words of bitterness, but words of pathos. And really, sort of hinting strongly, I'm not even sure if you can, you see. Is this above your pay grade, Jesus? I don't know. This is a tough case. Maybe not even you are going to be up to this. One commentator said, the ills of the world have been brought to the door of the church from the first century to the 21st. How often has it been said they could not? You know, the church has had all kinds of situations brought which actually, you have to say on the face of it, are way beyond the church's competence. But the church at her best recognizes that right off the bat. Doesn't try to be what she is not. The church knows that we carry a treasure in a fractured vessel. We are a fractured vessel, and we don't want to get too puffed up with how pretty are our fractures. Because the fact of the matter is, the treasure we have is something other than us. It is the power of Christ, and we feel the best favor we can do for this world is to just deliver Christ wholesale to the great needs that are brought to our doorstep. Sometimes it looks like it's way beyond us, and it usually is, but it's not way beyond Christ. And this humility to bring our needs to Him is in part what this story wants to remind us of. All right, paragraph 2. He answered them, the scribes, you faithless generation. How much longer must I be among you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me. And they brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. It's often cast him into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you are able to do anything, have pity on us and help us. And Jesus said, no, if you are able. All things can be done for the one who believes. Faith leading to power. Immediately the father cried out, I do believe, help my unbelief. Oh, how many times have we been there in our experience? Well, Jesus first of all responds to the scribes, you faithless generation. This is, of course, a word you're familiar with now, geneia. It's a word that is used virtually universally to mean a distinct generation of human procreation, 25 to 40 years. It's that generation which is faithless. Last week we noticed it was adulterous. It was a generation that committed treason against the marriage, the covenant marriage between Israel and her covenant husband Yahweh, thus called an adulterous generation. Here it's called a generation without faith, a faithless generation, and it is thus distinguished from the faithfulness of this father. Weak to be sure, not much faith going for him, but something is there, a kernel, a seed, the beginnings of faith. Jesus leads him along in this path, but in a sense leaves behind a generation that simply will not see who he is in spite of staggering and overwhelming evidence that should have led any reasonable person to embrace the truth of Christ as Messiah. How long will I be with you? As it turns out, not long. Jesus is about 2 months out from the crucifixion at this moment. This generation is going to try him in Jerusalem. But as a matter of fact, the truth of the matter is he's going to try that generation in Jerusalem and find it guilty and pronounce judgments against it. Not one stone will be left upon another. The language of judgment is going to be richly filling the Olivet Discourse, and that's all happening within the near future. How long will I be with you? Not much longer. Then, of course, the turning point, bring him to me. Faith in this story is not the healing agent. Jesus is the healing agent, but Jesus' power is deployed by faith in him and choked by doubt toward him. We see that more than once in Mark's gospel. Mark told us much earlier, he couldn't do many mighty works there because they didn't have any faith, when he was there in Nazareth. Well, it wasn't that Jesus ran out of power wasn't that all of a sudden his batteries were discharged. But the unleashing of Jesus' power is always a response to, a result of the touch of faith. The woman reaches out and touches his garment in faith. That's what unleashes the power to be realized in a given situation. And when we come to Christ nitpicking, unbelieving, criticizing, fault-finding, you're not going to see any power. When people come to the Bible and all they can do is see little faults and problems and contradictions and this and that, and there's no faith, no confidence, they won't see it. They won't see the Word of God. They'll just see a bunch of stories that don't make much sense. But it's when we come to Christ through the eyes of faith that something happens, something changes, something becomes possible that was otherwise not possible. And so this man brings his son to Jesus, and when the boy saw him, when the demon saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him. He fell on the ground, wallowed, foaming at the mouth. There's a kind of elegant simplicity. Just bring him to Jesus, as opposed to the red-faced obstructionism of these scribes, you know. You just bring him to Jesus. The spirit convulsed him, literally tore him. And now we have this rather detailed description. He wallowed, he foamed. Sometimes things seem to go backwards before they go forwards. One commentator, Edward Schweitzer, said, quote, "This indicates how the presence of God can produce a storm and stress before anything constructive is accomplished." St. Gregory, centuries ago, said, "The expulsion of a deadly evil from our spiritual being is not accomplished without a terrible struggle, followed in some cases by extreme prostration." People have their demons, you know. We have demons, and sometimes to get rid of the demon in your life will put you through a ringer. It's worth it to get through to the other side, but sometimes the process can be agonizing. Notice again, Jesus doesn't just heal the kid. Okay, get out of here, demon. He talks more with the Father first. So he says to the Father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And the Father says, "Since childhood." I don't know that Jesus needed the case history. This wasn't really for Jesus' benefit, but it was certainly for the Father's benefit, because he's leading him along. He's begun with such tenuous faith, but Jesus keeps leading him in the direction of greater confidence. So the information was not intended to educate Jesus, but to encourage the Father's faith, because it was the Father's faith that would connect the power of Jesus with the need of his Son. We're Presbyterians. You know, customarily we baptize infants. I grew up in a Baptist tradition. If you had told me when I was maybe 20 years old that someday I'd be a Presbyterian, I would have just, thought you were really not very smart, As it turns out, you're very smart. Because then I was a Baptist. And I thought, this is terrible. Take these little babies and baptize them. They don't know what's going on. You got to wait till the kid knows what's going on. What part of this don't you get? Well, you know what? The part that I didn't get was that we don't bring infants to the baptismal font because we think there's any faith in the infant necessarily. It's the parent's faith. And again in the biblical testimony, you'll find that parents' faith becomes the link between the power of God and the benefit of the child. When Jairus came and asked Jesus to come for his daughter wasn't the one with faith at that point. She was dead, you see. When the Syrophoenician woman came to Jesus, it wasn't the daughter who had faith, it was the Syrophoenician woman who had the faith, and power flowed through her to her child. And we believe that when we bring our infant children to the baptismal font, it's the faith of the parent. We make commitments that reflect true faith. And we see that sign of the cross put on that child, an indelible mark that that person is a member of the community of faith, and we make a promise at that point we're going to raise this child in the faith in the sure, deep hope and confidence that as we do so, faith will eventually be born in that child's heart, and the baptism will be fulfilled and made richly full and complete at some point along the line. And we see plenty of evidence of that kind of thing. This is only one, of course, of many examples of it, and I'm on that rabbit track that's going to make me run out of time, so excuse me. Matthew and Luke, by the way, ignore this whole conversation. It's a different agenda for both of them. They both have a different point to make, but Mark is all about faith leading to a display of power because he wants to see it in the context of suffering leading to glory. This is the application of the great truth that we learned in the Transfiguration. The man says he's been in this condition from childhood. It's a form of the Greek word paideia. It means infancy, not just being a little boy, a toddler, but really from infancy. It's a gentle reminder, I think, for us that our lovely little bundles of joy born into our families arrive DOA spiritually. The Apostle Paul says we were dead, not sick, not dying, dead in trespasses and sins, gripped by the ravaging effects of original sin. Thus we are victims, as it were, of our own disobedience back in the Garden of Eden when we come into this world. The man goes on and explains he's often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. There's probably no natural forces more common than fire and water. You can virtually turn on the evening. Of course, in Spokane, we've had some experience with water lately. You notice that? And fire. Because those are the two natural forces that just seem to be perennially threatening the edges of our ordered society. When are we going to get a flood? We happily don't have a lot of floods here, but it seems like almost every night you can look at somewhere in the country where they're flooding, and the rest of it's burning. Fire and water. And this seems to be the expression of the threats to this boy, fire and water, throwing him into one, throwing him into the other. We enter life, I don't want to stretch the point too far, but in a sense we enter life victimized by these powers within us, fire and water threatening us, wanting to destroy us. And what's going to deliver us from any of that? Well, the man desperately says, if you can do anything. Can you do anything about this? Deep pathos mixed with a little glimmer of hope. And then he says, if so, have compassion on us, help us. This is faith again and again. Faith always comes in a transaction of mercy, not merit. Faith never comes, true faith never comes negotiating, bargaining, dickering, deal-making, quid pro quo. Look, Jesus, if you do this, I'll do that. No, faith realizes we deserve nada. We deserve nothing from Him. We come broken, fractured, guilty, deserving nothing. And we simply appeal for mercy. That's why it's impossible to be proud of your faith, because faith is at the very heart of the matter, the deepest sense of our desperate need before a God who in that setting is happy to provide. God gives grace to the humble. Well, the man had said, if you can do anything, and Jesus reverses it. No. It's not if I can do anything, it's if you can do anything. All things are possible to the one who believes. Faith will lead you to power. Faith will lead you to a display of God's omnicompetence. But the doorway to that display of power is your faith. Do you have that ability? Well, of course, the response that the man gave is answered by this wonderful expression that we have at this point when he cries out, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. That's where we all are. None of us have perfect faith. Some of us in this room have amazing faith. I'm not going to name any names, but I happen to know some of you have just astonishing faith. Some of us are struggling. All of us can say, I believe, help my unbelief, because we are all on a journey in which faith is growing. And we are all, therefore, with this man in some sense or other as our life story is unfolding, mixing on the one hand a great affirmation that we have faith with the doubt that continues to riddle us when we look at the next challenge that's just around the corner. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. All right, I'm moving fast because time is going. Here's our last paragraph. When Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You spirit that keeps this boy from speaking and hearing, I command you, come out of him, never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he was able to stand. When he had entered the house, the disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we cast him out?" And he said, "This kind can only come out through prayer." Jesus saw the people coming running. He probably didn't want a spectacle. He didn't want a disruption of this private conversation, and so he cuts to the chase, banishing the demon with a word. We've seen the strong man motif throughout Mark. This is once again a stronger man bested by a stronger one. And there's no contest in that head-to-head conflict. The spirit cried out, convulsed him, came out. He appeared to be dead. This was probably the demon taking his last shot. Some have thought maybe this demon had some kind of unusual power, one of the upper echelons in the panoply of hell's authorities. We don't know. Archbishop Trent, great commentator in the Anglican tradition, said, quote, "Most unwillingly does the evil spirit depart, seeking to destroy that which he can no longer retain." Another commentator said, "He's like an outgoing tenant that cares not what mischief he does in the house that he is quitting." Some of you have been landlords. You know something of that by personal experience. But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. Here's the awful majesty of Jesus with the gentle humanity. He takes him by the hand. Mark loves to use that kind of language. We've seen it many times. The word for arose here is actually the word for rising from the dead, agero, and it's the word that's used to describe Jesus' own resurrection. So maybe he was dead. We don't know, but anyway, Jesus picked him up. Later, when he was in the house, his disciples asked him, "How's come we couldn't cast it out?" And Jesus said, "This kind can only come out by prayer." Later copies of Mark add the word fasting, but the best manuscripts of Mark do not include it. And so I'm putting it in brackets there because it's a dubious addition to it. They asked the question, why couldn't we cast it out? Christian ministry oscillates between what we've seen God do in the past and what we're not so sure he can do in the future. And our confidence is hanging there in the balance in situations like that. So the man grew in his faith, the disciples grew in their faith. The disciples had to train. Just as this man was growing, they had to learn new disciplines of trusting Christ in the face of challenges. And in some ways you would say that the disciplines they learned were at least in some ways represented by prayer, standing for all Christian disciplines. Not just one single prayer at one single moment, but a life of prayer, a life of devotion to Christ, a life of studying His Word, letting it dwell richly within us, a life of participation in the community of faith. This is where faith grows, and this is what gives us the stuff we need for the next challenge that we may confront. I'll pass by all of this and give you now in the last 60 seconds my Sunday school lesson. I'll end right on time. See, a little quick editing. Point number one, Sunday school lesson. The first rule of this kingdom that we're learning about now is that suffering must come before glory. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, He will exalt you. God resists the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. That's a paradigm that we see again and again, and it's a review of last week's lesson, the Transfiguration. Second rule of the kingdom. Faith in Christ during suffering will unleash the power of Christ in glory. Suffering leads to glory, but the practical application is that we learn to trust Christ in the time of suffering so we can see God's glory vindicated when His power is unleashed to meet whatever the circumstance is that's causing us difficulty. And finally, the third rule of the kingdom is that faith grows. I believe, help my unbelief. Faith grows. It grows through exercise, leading to power sufficient to move mountains. If you believe, all things are possible. The extravagant promises of the New Testament are just staggering to us. And we hardly believe it. And yet that's the call of the New Testament continually, that we would embrace the highest kind of adventurous confidence that this God who is the creator of everything is perfectly happy to provide abundantly beyond all we can ask or think, but the requirement is we come to Him in confidence, in faith, in trust. Amen. I'm done.